you just brought up like, oh yes, how do we talk about robots? And I was like, I checked like a little bit afternoon, and we immediately had a comment. And it was just shoot robot.
Shoot robot, yeah.
Recommend, yeah.
I'm
Recommended,
leaving. Like, we're good.
cool.
Oh.
Right, and we designed a lot of different robots. They basically fall into two categories. They're either grunts or elites, and then of course there's the final boss.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you and the team come up with these different fighting styles for the robots?
Sure, absolutely. For the main enemies, we have the elites, which, the kaiju and the griffin, which are a little bit more dynamic and have a little bit more difficulty to them. And then you have like your typical fodder, which we call the imp. It's a lot slower, it's a little bit weaker, but you find a lot more of them. And so that's kind of how we distinguished it, is you have a ton of these smaller enemies, and then you have the more difficult enemies to help break it up for the combat phasing.
Absolutely. So the imps, like we said, are a lot more common, so they don't really have that many special features to them. They basically just try to surround the player and work together in groups. And really overwhelm the player with just their sheer numbers. And then they really just have a little gun that they shoot. It's not that special. It doesn't do a ton of damage. When we first started, we didn't even have the concept of flying enemies at all. So our first two little fodder enemies were the pixie and the imp. And the pixie is the one that's not in the game. And with the imp, like I said, it kind of tries to surround the player, but it does keep its distance as well. Whereas the pixie would try to get as close as possible, and it was basically a walking bomb. So as soon as it got within super close range of the player, it would just explode. And both of those types of enemies, originally we had, a lot of each type. So it was kind of a balancing act of, I'm trying to stay far away from all of the enemies and not let them get too close to me, or else I'm just going to get overwhelmed. And then for the scarab, which was the second flying enemy, I think we considered that to be a grunt type as well, even though it was flying. But it was also kind of the same thing as the pixie. Just instead of being on the ground, it was able to, go up and down as it chased the player constantly. And then as soon as it was in range, boom, explode. Very intense, lots of damage there. So those two unfortunately ended up being cut, but they were cool. But then for the elite enemies, with the kaiju, which is more tanky, it has a lot more health, obviously, but it also, every few seconds, will fire off a missile barrage, which is just a really impactful, just like pow, 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 just like constantly shooting at you, so you really have to dodge and avoid it. But it is slower, so it doesn't come at you so often.
Another thing that we ended up getting rid of was the kaiju had a mechanic where from the front, he took significantly less damage in the back.
Yeah.
And in general, we wanted to have weak points for the enemies as well.
Yeah, we did have them for a while, but they were hard to convey because it was basically just little spots. I think what we wanted to do was all of the AI have these little glowing areas on them, and I think we wanted to somehow show the player that if you shoot the glowy spot, it hurts them more. But it was like, they're really tiny glowy areas, and it would be hard to show the player like, oh, my bullet just did a lot more damage than usual. Oh well.
Right.
It was very confusing. The flying elite type, the griffin, will shoot a laser at you, which just like follows you around as you're trying to escape from it, and it also is a lot zippier feeling. It flies around all just not trying to stand still and constantly attacking you. So yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me, the model for the griffin that's in the final product, that actually was meant to be the scarab's model at some point.
Yeah, these very, very ambitious artists, I said, hey, we need a flying robot enemy that's kind of based around an orb and has some sort of, spinning laser attack. And then they come up with this huge enemy, and you go, that's not a fodder enemy, that's an elite. That's a little too scary.
It is gorgeous though.
Very, very amazing robots that our team created. But yeah, it's interesting the road we went down. Yeah.
Remember the rally cry that the griffin had
Oh,
for
yeah.
the longest time?
Oh,
Yeah, we originally, when we were making the elites, we wanted them to have different special abilities for whether the player was nearby or far away. So I think the Griffins was the one with the rally cry and the
Yes.
laser beam. And I think the rally cry was for when it was close, because then it would basically buff all of the other enemies and they would just be absolutely berserk for a few seconds, and it was extremely overwhelming.
We didn't realize it till we removed the mechanic, but a lot of playtesting data from around that time was a bit more invalid than we thought. I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah. Well, and we also ran into like some conveyance issues with it of like, how do we actually show like this robot's now berserk?
Yeah,
He's so much
exactly.
stronger because
Yeah.
of the rally cry.
All our playtesters, they just like suddenly just get nuked.
Yeah, it was just like, wow, they're
Absolutely.
really strong.
And they're like,
now.
oh man, that's strong, and they like have no idea. So, actually, and that actually reminds me. Do y'all remember very early in development around prototype when we had the idea to have like kind of like randomly generated robots in terms of appearances
Oh yeah.
with the modular enemies?
So, yeah, with the generation of the robots, we had an amazing art team with some super strong modelers. They're able to whip out these incredible sculpts with these, huge robots with long Dr. Octopus, that's not his name, just these over-the-top amazing robots. But there's more to the pipeline of making enemies than just making a robot. So starting off, my job was to mitigate the stress on the artists and make that pipeline a lot easier. So I came up with using kit bashing, which would also help with the cohesive look of the robots, where you're using these parts that you've made, kind of like a manufacturing, like, oh, I have a base that is the head of the imp that I can then use for the head of the boss, which we did do a little bit of, but basically an assembly of you create these parts, you can create more robots, it's a little bit easier. The enemies overall have kind of a very similar design to each other, where there's a lot of detail in them, like the imp has imp written on it, and we wanted them to feel cohesive as if they were manufactured, in the same place. But we still, further down the road, there's so much more to making an enemy. We ran into a bottleneck with animation, where if we had gone through and done this, I remember at some point our artist Jimmy had this super cool concept where it was this robot that was tall and menacing, and it had like very long arms, and I was just asking him, like, how do you animate that? Like, whenever we design, we try to work with the level designers and ask the programmers, hey, what are the actions this robot does? What will it look like in terms of its attacks, its movement? What do you want it to feel like and do? And we had all these amazing robots, but then it got to, how are we going to animate that? What's that attack going to look like? And the animation and preparation, getting it from a model to an in-game asset was just way harder than, these amazing artists are able to whip out a sculpt, and we got really good, momentum early on, and then ran into, we now have 3 different fodder enemies, where now we only have 1, but ultimately it's the cut downs for the sake of the game.
Yeah, well, you can only do so much in 5 months, and I think 1.5 of them was just prototyping. Originally, we were going to do the isometric, and we stuck with that for pretty much the whole summer, and came back in the fall like, no, I think a third-person shooter is better for what we want to do.
But that influenced the enemies so much, because like before that we only had 2 dimensions to really worry about, so that's why we only had the now cut pixie and the imp. I think they were named, what did you originally name them?
Oh god, don't ask me that. Fiend, maybe?
No, it was the Growler and the Howler.
That's
Yeah.
right.
The
Oh god, that was
Growler and the
so
Howler.
confusing
Very-
for everyone.
It's like
I'm
they're
so
both
sorry.
owlers.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that was a naming convention nightmare. But once we transitioned to a third-person shooter, no offense, once we transitioned to a third-person shooter, we were like, oh, we can shoot upwards now. Let's give an enemy that's going to be up above us, and that influenced the now-cut Scarab and the Griffin. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think some of that also influenced the fact that we didn't really give the enemies guns or like turret-looking things, because we didn't want the turret to have to like, rotate around or anything. They just kind of magically shoot their bullets, but it's for the best.
So for the playstyle, we kind of like looking for the Doom style. So encourage the player to be aggressive, to have lots of movement, to kind of like exciting fight in the arena. And for the elite enemies, we design 2 types. The first type is a flying type, name is Griffin, and that is help the player to have the verticality combat in the arena. and which definitely increase the interesting and the difficulty of the combat. And also we have the kaiju. It's a type of the tank, and the player need to fight for a little bit long time with him, and at that time the ground enemy will surrounding and the player will can have more difficult to fight them.
Yeah, absolutely. We ultimately kind of try to decide of like how can we group play styles into these specific enemy types, where like for example you have the kaiju, you have this intense missile barrage, right? Well, if a player is trying to just hide the whole time, that missile barrage is very deadly for them, especially if they're staying in one place. So we're trying to encourage movement with that. However, when you have the griffin who's flying is a little zippier, you have to kind of move around and you have to try to be a little bit more strategic with your shot placement. So it actually helps sometimes to stand still and actually shoot it versus zipping around because it's just as fast. So we really wanted each enemy type to really change up how the player has to think about how they want to approach each situation.
Originally, when we were planning the AI, we had them kind of on patrol routes, and they would see the player, lose sight of the player, so you could kind of sneak around more and not always be in combat. But when we switched to a more arena-style focused game, we decided that the enemies just always know where you are, so you're always going to be barraged, even though they do have different movement types.
Because the problem is the player always stuck into the arena, and they don't know like the door are locked. They don't know what time is right to get out, and they couldn't find the last enemy. They need to like cross the room again to find the last one, which is feel really bad. So when the AI is turning to be more aggressive, will definitely help the level to be more good.
Yeah, having them all focused on you is really good, because one thing we figured out later in development is that our game actually had elements of a bullet hell involved, and I think having them all focused, having them all trying to actively kill the player always, and having them all just spewing bullets out really helped just improve that aspect of the gameplay and just makes it feel that much more intense.
You know, especially when you get into some of those arenas, you have like all of these bullets, right? And we wanted to make sure that we're conveying to the player as fast as possible, like, oh, this is from the kaiju, this one's from the imp, right? And you're able to ascertain as quickly as possible because it's a very up-paced game and there's a lot coming at you, so we just really wanted to help distinguish it right away.
Yeah, I know that for me, sometimes when I'm playing, I'll see the griffin's bullet before I see the griffin itself, and that helps me figure out what to do and where to go.
Since it was becoming such a bullet hell, what made it help differentiate was having those color-coded bullets themselves. So you'll go through, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there are some difference between the bullets themselves, like the speed at which they approach you and the damage they do. So really just having color-coded conveyance helped out overall to make sense of hell.
So we got like 2 level designers. So one is focusing on to balancing the different enemies' gun. He made a spreadsheet. Another, and with me, is we are focusing on balancing the arena combat. We have the arena manager, which will allow us to make different waves of enemies and how many numbers and what type of enemy they spawn. Those are, we are keep testing and keep playing, and heard lots of playtesters' feedback, and based on that to kind of like balancing a progress, increase the difficulty of the game.
I like the amount of types we actually ended at within the final game, because if I remember correctly, Angela, it kind of worked out that we ended up having 3 guns in the final product, 3 enemies in the final product, and each enemy was kind of like susceptible to like a certain gun, or each gun at least kind of like worked well against that enemy.
Yeah.
We have 3 level spaces too, right?
Ooh, it's true.
The power of 3.
Power of 3.
With 2 phases in the boss.
So
Dakota, you screwed up.
I know.
If you consider the part where you just walk up to it,
3 phases.
yeah,
There
3
you
Phase
go. There you
0.
There we go.
On top of the grunts and elites, we also had the final boss, which was a little bit different from the other enemies.
Yeah, so our enemies, all of the AI, have one behavior tree that is running and managing them, but the boss actually is not technically an AI in that sense. It doesn't use the behavior tree. Since it was so special and unique from the other ones, luckily, when we were creating the AI, we used components so that we were able to easily just like drop things and behaviors in and take them out. So we could add those just as easily to the boss. So you see when you're playing it, there's 2 different phases. In the first phase, it's really close quarters combat, and he uses the same laser that the Griffin does to attack you. Whereas in the second phase, the arena opens up and you're able to run around a lot more. So then he starts using the missile barrage, which is the same thing that the kaiju uses. But yeah, it's technically not running the same behavior tree. So just a little bit different.
So the original prototype actually started off with paper. There was one day we were just like cutting out some hexagon, and we were using, especially at the beginning, a lot of like hexagon in our shape language. And because AGRYOS Recovering Eden has a lot of plant-like elements, the original idea was this folding flower that was just kind of more geometric. And that's where it kind of originally started with, where, oh, wouldn't it be cool if it was like this flower that opened up, and then it's when we started prototyping and getting into it. And I think from there, that's when we were like, well, we don't want to necessarily do a whole bunch of brand new mechanics, because then we have to kind of teach the player, hey, this is completely different than what you've been doing for the entire game. So we were able to reuse kind of like what Kayla was talking about, where, you know, this is what the Griffin does in the first phase. So the player's already familiar, and as it's the boss, it's already high stress and very intense in its own regard. We didn't want to add more elements of stress of like, oh, I've never seen this before, holy crap, right? So kind of reusing what we have already been teaching the players subtly throughout the game to finally have this one final moment of mastery with the 2 phases.
And I do think the boss was quite a challenge to get right with how intense it was, because I think at first we made a new mechanic for it, and we might have made multiple, but the one I remember the best is like a floor is lava mechanic when you were in the close quarters. And basically there's a flat area, and then there's areas that you can jump on top of within that closed flower sort of space. And so every few seconds it would swap between whether the ground was lava or the tops of the pedestals were lava. And that was really difficult. I remember everyone was like, oh my god, I cannot beat this boss because I can't tell when I'm supposed to be where, and it was just like constantly damaging you. So it was fun trying to figure out the best way to make it hard but not too hard.
Yeah, that floor is lava mechanic, we figured that out back in the prototypes.
We held on that till more than halfway through development, and then we ended up scrapping it, but that's okay. We just gave the boss a lot of bullets.
That's true. Bullets at the same time as the laser.
Yeah, exactly. That's what made it difficult.
It's also constantly pulling in and spawning new AI. Anytime you kill another AI, it's just going to be replaced by the boss. And I think for me, playing it, when I'm looking up at the boss, because it's suspended from the ceiling instead of down on the ground and flying around like the others, it is in one center location, so you're like looking up and shooting it, and then suddenly you're getting damaged and you're like, wait, what? I'm like avoiding the boss, what's going on? And you look around you and there's all these enemies and you're like, okay, crap, I need to divert my attention real fast. So
And then that's also on top of the mechanic where once you're in the second phase of the boss fight, you have to shoot these little capsules that shield the boss. And so your attention's split between looking for the next object to shoot and shooting the boss itself and the enemies and moving while the boss shoots you with all his abilities. So it's very fun. It's very chaotic.
Those power cores, we didn't really know what to do with them earlier on. We wanted to introduce them earlier to explain the logic behind where the enemies were coming from.
now they just kind of magically spawn in, but it's fine because there's a pretty shimmery effect that the artist made, so it looks nice. That's all we care about.
It looks great.
And they go out with a bang.
They go
so
out with a boom.
that's really all
Yeah.
that matters.
Yeah.
We definitely went super ambitious because are we not the first capstone team to successfully have a boss
I
battle?
think so. I think we are the first.
Yeah, so we threw a lot into that just to make sure we started from the very beginning, where originally with the art especially we pitched the idea of having that dynamic environment where it unfolds and then, you know, that carried through with, you know, keeping all the components of the enemies that we loved, and then having that final boss battle with this amazing huge boss who's suspended from the ceiling and the cores and all of that you have to shoot. We went all out, and I'm really proud that we, you know, have a boss battle.
Yeah.
We're a 15-person team, so like we can only do so much, and so it's always better to, you know, start ambitious and then be like, all right, what do we want to do, and then kind of figure out as we go through the development, as we kind of figure out like what the game wants to be, and we go through all that. It's kind of becomes a little bit more clear what we can and can't do overall.
We started with so much ambition, so much momentum and energy, and you see that in the end product. We have a boss battle, we have such a fun, energetic bullet hell game, but I guess this is kind of the sneak peak into my
Ooh,
favorite subject.
robots.